The aroma of roasted turkey mingled with the weight of unspoken betrayal as I stood in my dining room that Christmas evening, watching my son Thomas raise his wine glass with the calculated precision of a man delivering a verdict. The crystal caught the candlelight, casting fractured rainbows across the white tablecloth that had adorned this table for 37 years of holiday celebrations. His wife Rebecca sat beside him, her manicured fingers drumming a silent rhythm against her water glass, her smile as sharp and cold as the December wind rattling our windows. The dining room bore witness to decades of family history. Every scratch on the hardwood floor told a story. The deep gouge near the window, where Thomas had dragged his high chair as a toddler. The faint water stain on the oak sideboard from the Christmas morning when Margaret had rushed to serve breakfast before the presents were opened. The gentle wear patterns around the table where countless family meals had been shared. The walls, painted a warm sage green that Margaret had chosen after months of deliberation, displayed 3 generations of family photographs. Wedding pictures, graduation ceremonies, holiday gatherings, and quiet moments of joy that seemed to mock the tension now filling the space. "Father," Thomas began, his voice carrying the authoritative tone he'd perfected in his corporate boardroom, the same voice he used to address subordinates who had failed to meet quarterly projections. "We've reached a difficult decision as a family." The word family hung in the air with a bitter taste of irony. Considering that this family meeting had been called without consulting the patriarch it was meant to dispose of. After careful consideration and consultation with professionals, we've determined that you're no longer capable of managing your affairs or this household. We're asking you to leave. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the gentle hiss of the radiator and the distant sound of Christmas carols playing softly from the kitchen radio. Around the table sat the witnesses to my humiliation, friends and extended family who had gathered for what they believed would be a traditional Christmas celebration. My sister Helen, her weathered hands clutched around a coffee cup that bore the words, "World's Best Mom," sat frozen in disbelief. Her husband Robert, a man who had known me since we were young fathers coaching Little League together, stared at his plate as if studying the holly pattern might provide some escape from this uncomfortable scene. The Andersons from next door, Jim and Carol, who had shared countless backyard barbecues and borrowed tools over the decades, exchanged glances of profound discomfort as they realized they had been invited not as guests, but as witnesses to a family coup. Before we continue with this profound story of dignity tested and wisdom earned, I'd like to invite you to subscribe to our channel if you appreciate thoughtful storytelling that honors life experience. Please also share your own insights in the comments, as your wisdom and perspective add tremendous value to our community. Now, let's return to this remarkable tale of a father's journey from generosity to self-respect. I had spent 72 years on this earth, 46 of them in this house, building a life with my beloved Margaret, until pancreatic cancer claimed her 4 years ago after a battle that left us both financially and emotionally depleted. Every beam, every floorboard, every carefully tended garden bed outside bore the imprint of our shared dreams and accumulated labor. The dining room where we now sat had witnessed Thomas's first uncertain steps as he clutched the table edge. His high school graduation party, where he'd announced his acceptance to Northwestern University with a scholarship that covered only half his expenses. His wedding reception, where Rebecca had insisted on upgrading every detail regardless of cost. The oak table, scarred by decades of family meals and homework sessions, had been crafted by my own father from lumber salvaged from a barn he'd helped demolish in 1955. It had served as everything from Thomas's art table when he was 6 years old, carefully covering it with newspaper before he painted his masterpieces, to Margaret's command center during her last Christmas, when she'd insisted on hand addressing 63 holiday cards despite her trembling hands. The table held more history than any museum piece, more value than any antique, And yet I could see in Rebecca's calculating gaze that she viewed it as nothing more than outdated furniture that would need to be replaced in her vision of a modernized home. Thomas, I said quietly, my voice steady despite the earthquake occurring within my chest. This is my home. I built it with your mother. Every mortgage payment, every repair, every improvement came from my hands and my labor. I gestured toward the built-in china cabinet that had taken me 3 months of weekends to construct. The crown molding I'd installed bore by painstaking board. The hardwood floors I'd refinished twice over the decades. I carried you across this threshold when you were 3 days old. Your mother nursed you in the rocking chair that's now in the den. You took your first steps in the hallway, just outside this room. Rebecca leaned forward then, her voice honey-sweet with manufactured concern, the tone she typically reserved for speaking to elderly customers at the bank where she worked as a loan officer. Richard, we understand this is difficult, but you're 72 years old. This house is far too large for one person, and frankly, the maintenance is beyond your capabilities now. Last month you forgot to turn off the garden hose, and the water bill was astronomical. 2 weeks ago, we found you trying to climb a ladder to clean the gutters. At your age, a fall could be catastrophic. Someone in my situation. The phrase echoed in my mind as I studied her face, noting the way her eyes avoided mine, focusing instead on a point just over my left shoulder. The practiced sympathy didn't quite reach her carefully applied makeup, which even in the candlelight couldn't completely conceal the calculation behind her concern. This woman, who had entered our family circle only 4 years ago, was now presuming to decide my fate based on incidents that could happen to anyone, at any age. The water hose incident she mentioned had been the result of my distraction while talking to my neighbor about his wife's cancer diagnosis, a conversation that had stirred memories of Margaret's final months and left me momentarily disoriented. The gutter cleaning attempt had been prompted by my observation that the downspout was backing up and threatening to damage the foundation I'd spent decades protecting. These weren't signs of incompetence. They were the actions of a man who cared deeply about maintaining the home his wife had loved. I observed the faces around the table with the detached clarity that comes when one's world shifts fundamentally beneath their feet. Helen's mouth was slightly open, her expression cycling between shock and growing anger as she began to understand what was really happening. Robert had set down his fork and was staring directly at Thomas with disapproval, his bushy eyebrows drawn together in the expression I remembered from occasions when neighborhood children had committed some offense requiring parental intervention. The Andersons looked as if they wished they could disappear entirely, their discomfort evident in Carol's nervous fidgeting with her napkin and Jim's repeated glances toward the front door. My cousin Martha, visiting from Portland for the holidays, sat rigidly upright with her hands folded in her lap, her nursing background making her particularly sensitive to the dynamics of elder care and family manipulation. Even Thomas's own children, my grandchildren Sarah and Michael, both home from college, seemed uncomfortable with their father's presentation, exchanging glances that suggested this was the first they'd heard of any family decision. I rose from my chair slowly, not from infirmity, but from the weight of sudden understanding and the need to maintain dignity in a moment designed to strip me of it. The movement caused Rebecca to lean back slightly, perhaps recognizing that the helpless old man she'd been describing bore little resemblance to the substantial figure now standing before her. My 6-foot frame, maintained through decades of physical work and daily walks, commanded attention even in this moment of orchestrated humiliation. The guests shifted uncomfortably, their holiday cheer dissolving into embarrassed silence as they realized they were witnessing something far different from what they'd expected. Helen cleared her throat as if to speak, but I raised my hand gently, a gesture that commanded respect even in this moment of attempted character assassination. The ring on my hand, my wedding band that I'd never removed despite Margaret's death, caught the light and reminded me of the vows we'd taken to honor and cherish each other until death, vows that hadn't expired with her passing, but extended to honoring her memory and the life we'd built together. I see, I said, reaching into my jacket pocket and withdrawing a manila envelope I had prepared 3 weeks ago when I first sensed the undercurrents of their plotting during Thanksgiving dinner. That evening, I'd overheard fragments of whispered conversations between Thomas and Rebecca, caught glimpses of documents hastily shuffled away when I entered rooms, noticed the way they'd begun speaking in code about the situation and what needed to be done. My 45 years as a mechanical engineer had taught me to observe patterns, analyze problems, and prepare for multiple scenarios before taking action. Before I respond to your generous offer, I continued, my voice carrying the authority of a man who had supervised construction projects worth millions of dollars and commanded the respect of teams of professionals. I have something for you both. Thomas accepted the envelope with the confident smirk of a man who believed he held all the cards, his corporate training having taught him to project certainty even in uncertain situations. His expression shifted dramatically as he opened it, his face draining of color as he read the contents. The confident smile that had been his trademark since adolescence vanished, replaced by something approaching panic. Rebecca snatched the papers from his trembling hands, her own confidence evaporating as she absorbed the documents within, her banker's training making her immediately grasp the implications of what she was reading. The envelope contained photocopies of their credit card statements, which I had discovered scattered carelessly across their bedroom dresser during my methodical investigation 3 weeks prior. $17,000 in debt across 6 different cards, with purchases that painted a picture of stunning fiscal irresponsibility and complete disregard for financial reality. Designer handbags worth more than most people's monthly mortgage payments, restaurant bills that exceeded my weekly grocery budget by factors of 10, spa treatments and luxury items that spoke to a lifestyle completely disconnected from their actual earning capacity. The American Express statement alone told a story of financial recklessness that would have made Margaret weep. A single shopping trip to Nordstrom totaling over $3,000. Charges from luxury hotels in Las Vegas during a weekend when they claimed to be visiting Rebecca's sick grandmother. Monthly subscriptions to wine clubs and gourmet food services that cost more than I'd spent on groceries during my first year of marriage. Each line item represented not just money spent, but values abandoned, priorities misplaced, and the fundamental disrespect for the concept of living within one's means that Margaret and I had tried to model throughout Thomas's upbringing. But more damning were the real estate documents I had uncovered in their shared home office. Papers showing their attempt to secure a second mortgage on my home without my knowledge or consent. They had already consulted with contractors about extensive renovations, planned using the equity I had spent 4 decades building through careful maintenance, strategic improvements, and the simple passage of time in an appreciating market. The contractor estimates revealed plans to gut the kitchen where Margaret had taught our son to bake cookies and prepare Sunday dinners, to tear out the bathroom where I'd given him baths as a toddler, to remove the built-in bookshelves where he'd kept his childhood collection of adventure novels. Most devastating of all was the recorded conversation between them that I had captured using the security system I had quietly installed when their nocturnal discussions grew increasingly secretive and their behavior more suspicious. The technology had been recommended by my neighbor Jim Anderson, whose own home had been burglarized 6 months earlier, but I had never imagined I would be using it to document the plotting of my own family members. The recording revealed their plan in chilling detail. They intended to have me declared mentally incompetent through a carefully orchestrated campaign of documenting minor incidents and magnifying them into evidence of cognitive decline. They had researched the legal process for adult guardianship, consulted with an attorney about the steps necessary to gain control of my assets, and even discussed which of my belongings they would keep and which they would sell to fund their desired lifestyle upgrades. "What is this?" Thomas whispered, his corporate confidence crumbling like a sandcastle at high tide, his voice carrying the uncertainty I hadn't heard since he was a small child caught in some minor transgression. "Evidence," I replied simply, my engineer's precision making the word carry more weight than any emotional outburst could have achieved. Evidence of your plan to defraud me of my home, my savings, and my dignity. Evidence of your complete contempt for the man who sacrificed his own dreams to fund your education, your wedding, your lifestyle, and your apparent belief that you're entitled to inherit my security while I'm still living to need it myself. The room erupted into murmurs of shock and disapproval as the guests began to understand the true nature of what they were witnessing. Helen stood abruptly, her coffee cup clattering against its saucer, her face flushed with the kind of righteous indignation that had made her a formidable advocate during her 30-year career as a social worker. Thomas William Henderson, she said, using his full name in the way that had terrified him as a child. How dare you? How dare you sit at your father's table, eat his food, and plot to steal his home? Robert nodded grimly, his disappointment evident in the way he pushed back from the table and crossed his arms, a gesture I recognized from countless Little League games when he disagreed with an umpire's call. Son, he said to Thomas, though they weren't related by blood, the term carrying the weight of decades of family friendship. This is about the most shameful thing I've ever witnessed. Your father worked himself half to death, putting you through college, and this is how you repay him. The neighbors exchanged glances of profound discomfort, suddenly understanding they had been invited to witness not a concerned family intervention, but an attempted financial and emotional assassination. Jim Anderson, a retired police officer whose instincts for criminal behavior remained sharp, studied the documents with the professional eye of someone who had investigated fraud cases. Richard, he said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of his former profession, this looks like attempted elder abuse to me. You might want to consider involving the authorities. My grandchildren, Sarah and Michael, both home from college for winter break, sat in stunned silence as they processed the revelation that their father had been plotting to dispossess their grandfather. Sarah, a junior at Northwestern studying social work like her great-aunt Helen, looked particularly stricken as her professional training helped her understand the full implications of what had been planned. Michael, a sophomore studying business, was staring at the credit card statements with the horrified fascination of someone learning firsthand how not to manage personal finances. Rebecca attempted to salvage the situation with desperate damage control, her banker's training in crisis management kicking in despite her obvious panic. Richard, you're taking this completely out of context. We were simply exploring options for your future security, trying to understand what resources would be available if you needed care. The renovation plans were just ideas, dreams really, about how we might improve the house for everyone's benefit. My future security, I repeated, allowing the irony to resonate through the room like the toll of a funeral bell. By mortgaging my home without my knowledge? By planning to sell the property where your husband was raised, where his mother planted the garden that still provides vegetables for my table each summer, where her spirit lives in every room and every memory. The garden had been Margaret's pride and joy, a carefully planned sanctuary where she'd grown tomatoes, peppers, herbs, and flowers that attracted butterflies and hummingbirds. She'd spent hours teaching Thomas about plant care when he was young, showing him how to identify beneficial insects and explaining the patience required for seeds to become mature plants. The irony that he was now planning to destroy that legacy for immediate financial gain was not lost on anyone in the room who had known Margaret's gentle dedication to nurturing growth, whether in her garden or in her family. Thomas found his voice, though it lacked its earlier authority and carried instead the whining tone I remembered from his adolescent years when caught breaking curfew or lying about homework assignments. Dad, we didn't mean for it to seem so calculated. We were trying to help, to plan for the future. You're not getting any younger, and we thought it would be better to address these issues while we could still work together to find solutions. Help, I said, my voice carrying the weight of accumulated disappointment and the bitter taste of betrayal by someone I had loved unconditionally for 38 years. Thomas, I worked double shifts at the manufacturing plant for 15 years to pay for your college education when the scholarship only covered partial tuition. I drove a 20-year-old pickup truck with a manual transmission and no air conditioning while you live in the dormitory I funded, complete with meal plans and spending money for activities. I postponed my own retirement by 3 years to ensure your mother received the experimental cancer treatment that gave us 6 additional months together, treatment that wasn't covered by insurance and cost us nearly $60,000 that I gladly paid for the privilege of holding her hand a little longer. The memory of those final months brought a tightness to my chest that had nothing to do with age or infirmity. Margaret had insisted on maintaining hope even when the doctors privately told me there was none, had continued planning for a future she knew she wouldn't see because she wanted me to believe in the possibility of recovery. Her last months had been filled with quiet moments of profound connection, conversations about our life together, and gentle instructions about how she wanted me to continue living after she was gone. Never once had she suggested that our son might someday try to claim that future for himself. I remember driving you to your first job interview at 16. I continued, my voice steady despite the emotional weight of the memories. You were terrified that you wouldn't know what to say, so we practiced answers to potential questions for an hour in the parking lot. When you got the job at the grocery store, making minimum wage bagging groceries, you were so proud to have your own money. You saved every penny for 3 months to buy your mother a Christmas present, a small bottle of perfume that cost $12. She wore it every day until it was gone. Not because she loved the scent, but because she loved that you had sacrificed to give her something beautiful. The guests began to excuse themselves as the family drama intensified beyond their comfort level. Their holiday cheer thoroughly destroyed by the ugly reality now laid bare. But several remained, including Helen and Robert, who had known our family long enough to feel personally invested in the outcome. Martha, with her professional background in geriatric nursing, stayed because she recognized the importance of having witnesses to what was clearly a case of attempted elder abuse. Carol Anderson squeezed my shoulder as she prepared to leave, her voice quiet but firm. Richard, if you need anything at all, Jim and I are right next door. Don't you hesitate to call us. The offer carried more weight than simple neighborly concern. It was a commitment to watch for signs of retaliation or further manipulation. As the house emptied of uncomfortable guests, leaving only family members and closest friends, the dining room felt simultaneously larger and more intimate. The candles had burned lower, their flickering light casting dancing shadows on the walls that seemed to echo the turbulence of emotions filling the space. The untouched turkey and side dishes sat cooling on their serving platters, the carefully prepared holiday meal now a backdrop to family destruction rather than celebration. Thomas and Rebecca sat before me, their carefully constructed narrative destroyed by their own carelessness and greed, their confident assumption of my mental decline proving to be the foundation for their own downfall. The son I had raised to understand the value of hard work and honest dealing had become someone I barely recognized, while the woman he had married revealed herself to be exactly what I had feared from the beginning. Someone whose love was conditional on access to resources she hadn't earned. You have 30 days, I said calmly, my voice carrying the weight of legal authority backed by documentary evidence. 30 days to find alternative living arrangements. The lease agreement you signed when you moved back in after Margaret's death included specific provisions for termination with cause. I believe attempted fraud qualifies as sufficient cause, and I'm certain any court would agree. The lease had been my attorney's suggestion, a way to formalize the arrangement when Thomas claimed he needed to move home temporarily to help me cope with grief and household management. At the time, I had seen it as an unnecessary complication for what I assumed would be a brief arrangement until he got back on his feet financially. Now, I recognized it as the protection it was meant to be, providing legal framework for exactly this situation. Rebecca's composure finally shattered completely. her banker's mask slipping to reveal the calculating desperation beneath. "You can't do this to us, Richard. We have nowhere to go. Thomas is your son, your only child. How can you throw your own blood out on the street? You have the same options available to any young couple starting out." I replied, remembering the tiny apartment above the bakery where Margaret and I had begun our marriage, grateful for a roof over our heads and the opportunity to build something together through shared effort and sacrifice. The same options Thomas and I had when we first married and lived in 2 rooms that smelled of cinnamon and yeast, where we shared a bathroom with 3 other tenants and counted ourselves fortunate to have hot water most evenings. The difference is we were grateful for what we had and worked together to build something better through patience, sacrifice, and mutual respect. "But Dad," Thomas pleaded, his voice carrying the desperate edge I remembered from childhood moments when consequences loomed for poor choices. "Where will we live? The apartment market is terrible right now. And with our credit situation," his voice trailed off as he realized he was essentially admitting to the financial irresponsibility that had created their current crisis. "You'll live wherever you can afford," I said firmly. "You'll downsize your expectations to match your actual income instead of the lifestyle you think you deserve. You'll learn to budget, to sacrifice, to work additional jobs if necessary. You'll discover what thousands of young couples learn every day, that building a life requires earning it, not inheriting it." Sarah, my granddaughter, spoke for the first time since the revelation began, her voice small but clear. "Grandpa, I'm so sorry. I had no idea they were planning this. If I had known—" Her voice broke as she struggled with the realization that her own parents had been plotting to harm someone she loved. "You have nothing to apologize for, sweetheart," I assured her, recognizing that she and Michael were victims in this situation as much as I was. "This isn't your responsibility or your shame to carry. Your father and stepmother made these choices without consulting you, and they'll face the consequences without involving you." Michael, my grandson, cleared his throat nervously before speaking. "Grandpa, could Sarah and I stay here with you? At least until we go back to school? I don't want to be part of whatever this is." His gesture toward his father and Rebecca carried a mixture of disgust and disappointment that clearly wounded Thomas deeply. "Of course," I replied immediately. "This is your home too, whenever you need it. Your grandmother always said this house should be a sanctuary for family members who honor what it represents." The following weeks passed with the strange mixture of sorrow and relief that accompanies necessary but painful decisions. Thomas and Rebecca moved out quietly, their exit marked by sullen silence rather than acknowledgement of their wrongdoing or apology for the pain they had caused. They took with them the expensive belongings they had accumulated during their time of financial irresponsibility, leaving behind the family photographs and mementos that had never held value in their eyes, but represented decades of shared history to those who remained. Rebecca's departure was particularly swift and cold, her banker's efficiency serving her well as she organized the logistics of extraction without emotional messiness. She boxed her designer clothes and expensive accessories with the same clinical precision she might have used to foreclose on a defaulted loan, showing no sentiment for the home that had sheltered her for 2 years or the family that had welcomed her despite reservations. Thomas's departure was more complicated, weighted with the obvious pain of leaving behind not just a house, but a relationship that had defined much of his identity. He moved slowly through rooms that held 40 years of memories, occasionally pausing to touch a doorframe where his height had been marked through childhood, or to stare at a window where he'd once hung Christmas decorations with his mother. But his nostalgia was tempered by resentment, his inability to accept responsibility for the situation evident in his muttered complaints about being kicked out rather than recognition that he had forfeited his welcome through his own actions. I spent those January days walking through rooms that felt simultaneously emptier and somehow larger without their presence. The house began to breathe again, no longer choked by the tension of hidden agendas and whispered conspiracies that had filled the air during their final months of residence. I found myself rediscovering spaces that had been transformed into storage for their excess possessions, reclaiming areas that held memories of happier times when the home had been filled with genuine love rather than scheming calculation. In Margaret's sewing room, which Rebecca had been eyeing as potential space for a home office from which to run some undefined consulting business, I discovered boxes of fabric she had collected for quilts she never had time to make. Each piece told a story, remnants from clothes she'd sewn for Thomas as a child, scraps saved from my work shirts that had become too worn for professional wear but too meaningful to discard, pieces of her own dresses from special occasions that she'd planned to incorporate into memory quilts for future grandchildren. The basement workshop, which Thomas had suggested converting into a home gym he would never use, revealed projects I had abandoned when caregiving consumed my time and energy during Margaret's illness. Half-finished birdhouses designed to her specifications, a partially restored antique chair that had belonged to her grandmother, tools organized with the precision of someone who understood that taking care of equipment was essential to taking care of family. The house was revealing itself to me again, offering comfort in its familiar rhythms and possibilities for new purposes that honored its history while acknowledging the changed circumstances of my life. Without the constant undercurrent of tension and manipulation, I could hear the house's natural sounds again. The settling of timbers seasoned by decades of weather, the gentle whisper of heat moving through registers, the comforting tick of the grandfather clock Margaret had inherited from her parents. My dear friend William, a retired attorney who had helped me navigate the legal complexities of Margaret's final illness and estate planning, visited regularly during those weeks of adjustment. We would sit in the living room with our coffee, discussing books, current events, and the philosophical implications of family loyalty versus self-preservation. His legal background provided valuable perspective on the situation, while his friendship offered emotional support during a time when family connections had proven unreliable. "You know, Richard," he said one snowy afternoon as we watched cardinals at the bird feeder Margaret had installed outside the kitchen window, their bright red plumage a vibrant contrast to the white landscape. "There's wisdom in setting boundaries, even with family. Especially with family, because those relationships often assume a level of trust that can be exploited by people who prioritize their wants over others' welfare." I keep questioning myself, I admitted, appreciating the safety of honest conversation with someone whose judgment I trusted, wondering if I was too harsh, if there might have been another way to handle the situation that could have preserved the relationship while still protecting myself from their scheming. William adjusted his glasses, a gesture I recognized as his transition into legal counsel mode, the same careful consideration he'd brought to complex cases throughout his 40-year career. "Richard, you protected yourself from financial and emotional abuse that was escalating toward a complete takeover of your autonomy and assets. You maintained your dignity and independence in the face of a calculated attack on both. Those aren't harsh actions, they're necessary ones. The harshness lies in their willingness to exploit your generosity and their complete inability to recognize their error, even when confronted with overwhelming evidence of their betrayal. Margaret always said that love without boundaries isn't love at all," I reflected, remembering conversations we had about parenting challenges when Thomas was younger. She worried that we were sometimes too generous, too willing to rescue him from the consequences of poor decisions. She wanted him to learn resilience and self-reliance, but I was often the one pushing for another chance, another loan, another rescue. "She was a wise woman," William said quietly, "and she would be proud of how you handled this situation. You gave Thomas 40 years of chances to learn these lessons voluntarily. Sometimes the most loving thing a parent can do is to stop enabling destructive behavior and allow natural consequences to provide the education that generosity failed to deliver." Spring brought unexpected developments that tested my resolve and challenged my assumptions about the finality of the changes I had implemented. Thomas called in early April, his voice subdued and uncertain in a way I hadn't heard since his teenage years, when phone calls home from college usually meant requests for money or confessions of academic struggles. He requested a meeting, claiming he wanted to apologize and discuss the possibility of reconciliation, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely certain what form that reconciliation might take. I agreed to meet him at a neutral location, choosing the small cafe downtown where Margaret and I had often enjoyed lunch dates during her treatment cycles, when brief escapes from medical appointments and hospital waiting rooms had felt like stolen treasures. The familiar environment provided comfort while maintaining appropriate boundaries, offering the possibility of civil conversation without the emotional weight of our family home. He arrived looking older somehow, the corporate polish dimmed by what appeared to be genuine wear and tear rather than calculated presentation. His usually perfect grooming showed signs of stress. Hair slightly disheveled, shirt wrinkled in a way that suggested he'd dressed hastily or perhaps slept poorly. Rebecca was notably absent, and I didn't inquire about her whereabouts, though her absence spoke volumes about the state of their relationship and possibly their living situation. We ordered coffee and sat in uncomfortable silence before he finally found words, his hands wrapped around his cup for warmth or comfort in the way I remembered from childhood moments when he'd struggled to express difficult emotions or admit to mistakes that carried serious consequences. "Dad, I've been thinking a lot about what happened at Christmas," he began, his voice lacking the confident authority he displayed during his attempted coup. "I want you to know that I understand now how wrong we were. How wrong I was." The distinction between plural and singular responsibility suggested some evolution in his thinking, though I remained cautious about accepting surface statements without evidence of deeper change. I studied his face carefully, searching for sincerity beneath what could easily be practiced contrition designed to regain access to the resources and security he had forfeited through his poor judgment. His eyes, which had avoided mine during our Christmas confrontation, now met my gaze directly, though they carried a weariness that suggested genuine struggle rather than strategic positioning. "What changed your mind, Thomas?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral while encouraging elaboration that might reveal the authenticity of his apparent transformation. He exhaled slowly, a sound that carried the weight of recent hardship and possibly the kind of self-examination that comes only through facing real consequences for poor decisions. "Reality, I guess. Living without the safety net of your house and your financial support forced Rebecca and me to face our actual situation rather than the fantasy we'd been constructing about our lifestyle and our future. The debt," I prompted, remembering the shocking totals revealed in the credit card statements I discovered. "Worse than you saw," he admitted, his voice carrying shame that seemed genuine rather than performed. "We've been using cash advances from one card to make minimum payments on others, juggling due dates, and hoping something would change before it all collapsed. When we had to find our own apartment and qualify for utilities and services, the extent of our financial irresponsibility became impossible to ignore." The admission revealed a level of financial dysfunction that went beyond mere overspending into the realm of systematic self-deception, the kind of magical thinking that assumes problems will solve themselves without intervention or significant behavioral change. Margaret would have been horrified, not just by the debt itself, but by the fundamental dishonesty required to maintain such a precarious situation while plotting to access other people's assets. "And Rebecca?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer based on her absence and Thomas's obvious discomfort. Thomas shook his head sadly, his expression carrying the particular pain that comes from discovering that someone you loved was less than you believed them to be. "Rebecca couldn't adjust to the change in circumstances. When we had to move into a small apartment and start budgeting for basic expenses, when she had to give up the spa treatments and designer shopping that had become her normal routine, she became resentful and angry. She blamed me for mishandling the situation with you, claimed I should have been more persuasive or more patient. She wanted you to try again? I asked, unsurprised by the revelation, but interested in understanding the dynamics that had led to their apparent separation. She had a whole plan, Thomas said bitterly. Ways to approach you that might be more successful, people she thought we should involve to advocate for us, legal strategies that might force you to provide support. She couldn't understand that what we'd done was wrong, only that it hadn't worked. When I told her I thought we owed you an apology and needed to focus on fixing our own problems, she said I was weak and stupid. The conversation continued for nearly 2 hours, meandering through memories of his childhood, his mother's illness, and the gradual deterioration of our relationship following Rebecca's arrival in our family. He spoke with what seemed like genuine remorse about the pressure he had felt to maintain appearances and provide for a wife whose expectations exceeded his earning capacity, and the resentment that had built when he compared his financial struggles to my comfortable retirement. I convinced myself that you owed me something, he said, his voice thick with shame that appeared authentic rather than calculated. That because you had sacrificed for my education and upbringing, I deserved to inherit your security before you were gone rather than building my own through work and patience. It was selfish and entitled, and I'm deeply ashamed of how we treated you, of how I let Rebecca's ambitions override my own sense of right and wrong. As I listened to his words, I found myself recognizing signs of genuine remorse that distinguished this conversation from his earlier attempts at manipulation during the Christmas confrontation. This wasn't strategic contrition designed to regain access to my resources, but rather the painful self-examination of a man confronting the consequences of his choices and finding them wanting. The quality of his regret seemed different from the superficial apologies he'd offered as a child when caught in misbehavior, carrying instead the weight of adult recognition that actions have lasting consequences and that some damage can't be easily repaired. His willingness to accept full responsibility for his decisions, rather than blaming circumstances or other people, suggested a level of maturity that had been absent during our previous interactions. Thomas, I said finally, choosing my words carefully, I appreciate your apology, and I can see that you've done some difficult thinking about what happened between us. The question is whether this represents genuine change or simply regret about the consequences you're facing. I understand your skepticism, he replied. I know that words are easy and that I've lost the right to expect trust based on my statements alone. I'm hoping that over time, my actions might demonstrate that this change is real. What does that look like practically? I asked, interested in understanding whether his self-reflection had translated into concrete plans for behavioral change. Thomas pulled out a small notebook, its pages filled with handwritten columns of numbers and calculations. I've been working with a financial counselor at the credit union, learning to budget and prioritize expenses in ways I never bothered to understand before. I've taken a second job delivering food on weekends to accelerate debt repayment, and I've started attending financial responsibility classes that help people dig out of situations like mine. The notebook revealed a level of detailed planning and self-discipline that I hadn't seen from him since his college years, when he'd actually maintain a budget to stretch his scholarship money and part-time job earnings. The handwriting was his own, suggesting personal involvement rather than delegation to someone else. And the calculations showed realistic projections for debt elimination that would require sustained effort over several years. I'm also seeing a counselor individually, he continued, trying to understand how I became someone who could justify treating you the way I did. It's not pleasant work, facing the ways I've failed to live up to the values you and Mom try to teach me, but I think it's necessary if I want to become someone worth having a relationship with. The mention of counseling surprised me, both because Thomas had always been resistant to the idea of seeking outside help for personal problems, and because it suggested a level of commitment to change that went beyond simply managing immediate consequences. During his teenage years, suggestions of counseling for various behavioral issues had been met with stubborn refusal and arguments about privacy and independence. Does that mean you might consider letting me earn back some place in your life? He asked, The vulnerability in his question reminding me of the uncertain child he had once been, the little boy who would approach me cautiously after misbehavior to test whether forgiveness might be possible. I considered my response carefully, weighing compassion against wisdom, love against the necessity of maintaining boundaries that had proven essential for my well-being and security. The part of me that would always be his father wanted to welcome him back immediately, to resume the relationship we'd once shared and pretend the betrayal had never occurred. But the part of me that had learned painful lessons about enabling destructive behavior recognized the importance of requiring genuine change rather than accepting promises of future improvement. I think we need more time, son, I said finally. Time for you to continue building this new understanding of yourself and your responsibilities. Time for me to heal from the betrayal and learn to trust again. But perhaps we can begin with occasional meetings like this one, conversations where we can work toward rebuilding what was damaged. But not never, he pressed, hope flickering his eyes in a way that reminded me of the eager child who had once sought my approval and guidance for every major decision. Not never, I agreed carefully. But not now and not quickly. Trust, once broken, requires time and consistent demonstration to rebuild. The damage wasn't done in a single moment, and healing won't happen in a single conversation. Over the following months, we maintained this careful distance and gradual reconnection, meeting monthly at neutral locations to share meals and conversation while avoiding the emotional complexity of our family home. Thomas demonstrated consistent commitment to the changes he described, providing updates on his financial progress and personal growth that suggested genuine transformation rather than temporary accommodation to circumstances. He shared details about his work with the financial counselor, showing me budgets and debt repayment plans that reflected realistic understanding of his situation and disciplined commitment to improvement. The second job he'd mentioned proved to be delivering meals for a food service company, work that required him to be available evenings and weekends while dealing with demanding customers and unpredictable weather conditions. It's humbling, he admitted during one of our monthly dinners, being 42 years old and learning basic money management from a counselor who's younger than I am. But it's also educational in ways I didn't expect. I'm beginning to understand the difference between wanting something and being able to afford it, between deserving something and being entitled to it. The counseling sessions were apparently challenging in different ways, forcing him to examine the attitudes and assumptions that had contributed to his willingness to betray family trust for financial gain. He spoke about recognizing patterns of entitlement and self-justification that had developed over years of receiving help without reciprocating, of assuming that his needs should take priority over other security. The counselor helped me understand that I've been treating your generosity as evidence that you didn't need what you were giving rather than a sacrifice on your part, he explained. When you paid for my college or helped with car repairs, I saw it as proof that you had plenty of money rather than recognition that you were choosing my welfare over your own comfort or security. By autumn, I began to see glimpses of the man I had hoped he would become, not the entitled and acquisitive person Rebecca had encouraged him to be, but someone who understood the dignity of honest work and the importance of living within one's means. Someone who respected the sacrifices others had made and was prepared to make his own rather than seeking shortcuts through manipulation or exploitation. The financial progress was measurable and impressive. 3 credit cards paid off completely, a realistic budget that actually balanced income and expenses, and a small emergency fund that provided security without enabling careless spending. But more importantly, his attitude toward money and responsibility had shifted from assumption of entitlement to appreciation for opportunity. I used to resent having to work overtime or take on additional responsibilities, he told me during one of our conversations. I thought I deserved to have a lifestyle I wanted simply because I had a college degree and a professional job. Now I'm grateful to have the ability to earn money and the opportunity to demonstrate that I can live up to my obligations. The following Christmas, after nearly a year of careful rebuilding, I invited Thomas to join me for a quiet dinner at home. Just the two of us. No grand gestures or dramatic confrontations. Simply a father and son sharing a meal in a house where he had grown up. The invitation represented a significant step in our reconciliation. Though we both understood it was conditional on continued evidence of genuine change. He arrived with a small gift, a framed photograph of Margaret and me from our wedding day that he had found among his belongings and had professionally restored. The image had been damaged by time and handling, but the restoration revealed details I had forgotten. The joy in Margaret's eyes, the hope in my own young face, the sense of possibility that had characterized the beginning of our life together. "I thought this might belong on the mantel again," he said, his voice carrying the same tentative hope I remembered from his childhood attempts to make amends after serious misbehavior. "I know I can't undo the damage I caused, but I wanted to honor Mom's memory and acknowledge the foundation you both built that I nearly destroyed." As we sat at the same table where our family had imploded 12 months earlier, I felt the possibility of genuine forgiveness beginning to take root. Not the quick absolution that enables continued poor behavior, but the deeper forgiveness that acknowledges wrongdoing while opening space for authentic change and renewed relationship. The conversation flowed more naturally than it had in years, touching on memories of Margaret, updates on his continued progress toward financial stability, and careful exploration of what a rebuilt relationship might look like. He spoke about missing the sense of family connection that had been lost through his poor choices, while acknowledging that rebuilding would require patience and continued demonstration of change priorities. "Thomas," I said as we cleared the dishes together, working in the kitchen where he had once helped his mother prepare holiday meals, "I want you to know that I'm proud of the work you've done this year. Not just the financial responsibility, but the emotional growth and willingness to examine difficult truths about yourself. Your mother would be proud too." He paused in his task, setting down the plate he'd been drying as his eyes brightened with unshed tears. "Thank you, Dad. That means everything to me. I know I have a long way to go to fully earn back your trust, but hearing that you can see positive change gives me hope that we might eventually have a real relationship again. I've been thinking about this house and its future," I continued, broaching a subject I had been considering for months as I observed his transformation. "It's too large for me alone, and holds too many memories to be sold to strangers who wouldn't understand its history or value its character. If you're interested, and if you continue on this path of growth and responsibility, perhaps we could discuss you moving back in, not as my dependent, but as my partner in maintaining our family home." The conversation that followed was detailed and honest, covering financial contributions, household responsibilities, and the boundaries necessary to maintain our individual dignity while sharing space. We discussed specific arrangements for utilities, groceries, maintenance costs, and the division of household tasks that would reflect his status as a contributing adult rather than a dependent child. The arrangement we outlined wasn't the enabling relationship Rebecca had envisioned, where access to my resources would fund their desired lifestyle, but rather a mature partnership between two adults who understood the value of what they were preserving. Thomas would pay market rate rent for his portion of the house, contribute to household expenses, and take responsibility for maintenance projects that reflected his renewed understanding of ownership obligations. "I want to be clear," I said as we finalized the general terms of the potential arrangement, "that this is contingent on continued evidence of the changes you've demonstrated this year. If you revert to the attitudes and behaviors that led to our crisis, the arrangement ends immediately, and this time there won't be another opportunity for reconciliation." "Understand," he replied seriously, "and I want you to know that I'm not viewing this as a return to the way things were before. I recognize that I forfeited that relationship through my own choices, and what we're building now is different, based on mutual respect rather than assumed entitlement." As winter deepened into the new year, Thomas gradually moved his belongings back into his childhood bedroom, now transformed into adult quarters that reflected his changed priorities and circumstances. The room that had once been filled with sports trophies and academic awards now contained financial planning materials, self-help books, and the simple furnishings of someone who had learned to distinguish between wants and needs. We established routines that honored both our need for independence and our desire for family connection, sharing some meals while maintaining separate schedules, collaborating on household maintenance while respecting each other's personal space. He contributed to household expenses through automatic bank transfers, took responsibility for specific maintenance projects, and gradually began to understand the true cost and value of homeownership. The house that had nearly been lost to greed and manipulation was saved through patience, boundary setting, and the possibility of redemption through genuine change. Our family, fractured by betrayal and selfishness, was healing through honest communication, mutual respect, and the hard work of rebuilding trust that had been shattered through poor choices. The relationship we developed was different from what we'd shared before the crisis, more careful, but also more honest, based on earned respect rather than assumed obligation. Thomas approached household decisions with input rather than assumption, contributed to family discussions with ideas rather than demands, and demonstrated daily that he understood the privilege of living in the home where he'd been raised. On quiet evenings, when Thomas was reading in the living room and I was tending to Margaret's plants in the sunroom she had designed as her winter sanctuary, I felt her presence in the peace we had created through struggle and growth. She would have handled the crisis with greater grace than I managed, but I believe she would approve of the outcome we had achieved through patience, firmness, and the willingness to maintain hope while requiring change. The garden she had planted continued to thrive under our joint care, producing vegetables and flowers that connected us to her memory while providing practical benefits for our daily lives. Thomas had begun taking responsibility for specific sections, learning about plant care and seasonal maintenance in ways that honored her legacy while developing his own appreciation for the patience and dedication that successful gardening requires. Thank you for joining me in this story of family resilience, the importance of maintaining dignity in the face of betrayal, and the possibility of redemption through honest accountability and genuine change. If this narrative has resonated with your own life experiences or challenged you to think about the balance between generosity and self-protection, I invite you to subscribe for more thoughtful stories that explore the complexity of family relationships, personal dignity, and the wisdom that comes from life's most difficult challenges. Please share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below, as I read every one and truly value the insights our community brings to these conversations. Your stories and wisdom help others who may be facing similar challenges in their own family relationships, and together we create a space where life's difficult lessons can be shared and understood.